Okay, let's go. For another episode of the Revenue Revolution podcast, sponsored by Jointflows. And today we've got Kunal on online with us on the podcast. So I'm Mick, founder and CEO of Jointflows. We've got Hitesh here, CRO of Jointflows. But today is really about you. So if you don't mind giving us a little intro about yourself, your company, your position, and then we can go into the conversation.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Kunal Pandya. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Sales Velocity Labs, a newly formed company that specializes in helping B2B companies to unlock revenue through sales performance optimization, essentially. I guess what we do differently is we help companies take a more data-driven approach to how they define their strategies and ultimately how they measure the impact of what they're doing as well. So yeah, that's what I do.
Awesome. Glad to have you here. I'm very passionate about enablement, about methodologies. I'm a former sportsman, so for me, it's really about teaching, coaching. Where do you see sales enablement fit within the sales landscape today?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because depending on who you ask that question, you're going to get different answers. But none of the answers are wrong, right? They're all right. It's just, what's the complete picture? So my view is quite simple. Sales enablement, or whatever it's going to be called, right? However it is, but sales enablement is ultimately about impacting revenue. That's the bottom line. It's about impacting revenue, but also creating efficiencies. So you're kind of impacting top and bottom line simultaneously. And there's a ton of things that go below that, right? As to what drives that, what makes it happen, and all that. But the way I see it, if revenue impact is not part of the statement when defining sales enablement, then it's missing something. Is my simple answer.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it's interesting that you said talk about revenue impact being part of that answer, which makes sense. And if you think about where the focus is at the moment within software, within SaaS, it's all about driving revenue, but driving profitable revenue. So it's interesting you said, top and bottom line as well. What are you seeing is changing within the landscape when it comes to sales enablement specifically? What new challenges are you seeing people are experiencing, and then what kind of strategies are you recommending people put in place to overcome this?
So the number one challenge that I'm seeing right now is all around data, first of all. So how do you become a data-driven enablement function, which moves away from being an operational focused enablement function? And when I talk to sales leaders, the number one question I ask them is, what is the revenue impact of your enablement function, right? And 90% of the time, the answer I get is, I don't know, right? What is the revenue impact of my, like it's a joke or something. But that's the problem, right? Because what are we investing into it? When we think about tech, when we think about people, when we think about the investment of time that sales leadership and reps are giving to enablement, that's a big investment, right? If you were to add it all up, but we don't know the return on investment on that, right? So that's the challenge that I'm seeing. And that all stems from the fact that a lot of enablement functions are being run operationally today. And that's for two reasons. One, that's how enablers are running it. That's how they choose to run it. That's within the comfort zone. That's what they do. But secondly, that's the expectation that's been set by sales leadership, right? Who are not only not answering that question around what is the revenue impact, but they're not wanting to ask that question. They don't feel there's a need for them to ask that question. It's a problem they don't necessarily know even they have, right? Until it's really spelled out. So moving from operational enablement, that's kind of where you are not really measuring what you're doing. You're performing what I call random acts of enablement, right? That's the right, enablement initially is based on who's shouting the loudest or who's asking for it the most, right? And you just do it like a tick box exercise. And that means that there's no real long-term strategy, right? It's very short-termism. It's checkbox, right? And that ultimately means you're not measuring it, which is why you cannot answer that question, right? So the challenge is, how do you move away from that to being strategic, right? Which essentially is saying you have a strategy which is data-driven, which is ROI-centric as well, meaning it is focused on the revenue needle-moving activities and programs. You're measuring it all. You're defining the right things that you need to do. You're measuring it subsequently, and you're seeing what the impact actually is, right? Doing that is hard, right? I say it very easily, but doing it is hard, and that's what I see as the number one challenge in enablement today. There's a consequence of this challenge, which is, of course, enablement is seen as a cost center. And when CFOs, and CEOs come calling and saying, "I want to find some cash from this business," which most businesses are doing today, they're going to look at the cost centers, right? They're not going to focus on the quota carriers initially. It's first going to be cost centers, and that's why we're seeing a rise in. One of the key reasons why we're seeing a rise in the layoffs when it comes to enablement teams.
Yeah, and it's really weird because when sales enablement is in place in a company, it's crucial for the company to operate. So they're essentially, my experience, at least from me, is they're responsible for onboarding, they're responsible for training, they're responsible for product update training, they're responsible for new product line training, they're responsible for methodology rollouts. It's like so fast, and
it is fast.
It's very, as you said, like it's hard to actually gauge what the impact on revenue is. So what solution do you see fit to essentially understand how much this is contributing to the bottom line numbers?
Yeah, it's not an exact science, right? It's never going to be. But when we think about attribution, everyone's fighting for attribution, right? Marketing are still fighting for attribution, and they still haven't cracked it 100%, right? Pre-sales fight for attribution. The sales rep themselves obviously are fighting for attribution. Well, they're going to get attribution. They're going to get 100% of what is owed, right? Even though I've seen sales reps who have done barely anything in companies, right, to close a deal. It's been the pre-sales, it's been the SDR generating the lead, it's been all of that, and they just set up a few meetings and it's been closed, right? But they're going to get 100%. I just think that it's time that enablement were part of that conversation in order to move it away from being an operational function, or at least being perceived as an operational function, even if it's not, right? The perception is what's key. And away from being a cost center into a strategic business driver, which adds value and there's a measurable return. So what's the solution to this? It's a tough one, right? But essentially the way I look at this, and it starts with my definition of enablement, which was all around revenue impact. So that's the key point. What is the revenue gap that we're trying to solve for? And typically, companies will be on a trajectory in terms of revenue, or what they've maybe done in the previous year versus where they need to be, right? And there's always a gap. Even if that gap is maintaining a level of revenue, which is what a lot of companies are having you do in the current climate, there's still a gap between forecast and where you need to be. Now, the name of my company obviously gives it away a little bit, but I focus on 4 levers of revenue impact. So those 4 levers are what is known as the sales velocity equation. Sales velocity is essentially four components. It's number of opportunities entering your pipeline, number of your average deal value for each deal that you close, your average win rate, so how many of those entering the pipeline are actually closing, and your average length of sales cycle, how long does it take you? Now, at the end of the day, these are the only 4 factors that impact how much you sell. There's a bunch of things underneath that, and of course, right in and around it, but ultimately, that's it. The equation itself, which is where it gets interesting, is if you multiply pipeline opportunities, the number of opportunities, your average deal value, and your win rate, and multiply those through and divide the result by length of sales cycle, you get a number. That number is known as a sales velocity, or in other words, the rate of revenue that you're generating on a periodic basis, monthly, however you're measuring it. Now, the key for me is, in order to define a strategy to impact that revenue gap, rather than saying, we need to grow revenue by 30% year on year, let's break it down into those 4 levers. What do we need to improve in terms of our pipeline opportunities? What do we need? What do we need our average deal values to be? What do we need our average win rate to be? What do we need our average sales cycle to be in order to deliver that level of revenue, to drill into the gap? And that's when it becomes interesting, because now suddenly when we have those levers and we know that we've got to find an additional 5% in our pipeline, we've got to find 3% in deal value, we've got to find 6% in average win rate, decrease length of sales cycle by 5%. that's around a 25% revenue growth, right? Bite-sized chunks, you've disseminated it. But that's where it gets interesting, which is now that I can start to think about those levers I need to pull, I can now start to define enablement strategies that drive those things, right? And for each of those levers, there will be a bunch of things that can be done, both from enablement's influence or even outside of enablement's influence. So if you increase average deal value, you increase your price, right?
Yeah.
But we need to enable our reps to be able to defend that price, to negotiate, to handle objections. We need to, right? So it's tied to that. Now, enablement itself doesn't directly attribute to those levers, right? Because like I said, increasing price has nothing to do with enablement really, right? So how do you define attribution? Well, there's another layer. That other layer are the leading indicators. And it's those leading indicators that actually drive each of those sales velocity levers. So for example, a leading indicator might be a competency. What are the key competencies that drive win rate? Right? Yeah, objection handling, ability to beat a certain competitor, getting to the right level in an organization, getting to executives, right? Multi-threading, all those kind of things drive win rate. But those are the key with the leading indicators is how can we make them more measurable, right? So this competencies is one, behaviors might be another, process is another, right? So do we have a process? Are we following that process? How many people follow it? And engagement and adoption, right? Whatever it is, are people doing what we want them to do? At the end of the day, an enablement strategy drives those things, right? So the way I see it is, if anyone's familiar with Simon Sinek's golden circle, we're starting with a why. That's basically what I've done there. You're starting with a why, which is your revenue gap and your sales velocity levers. The how are the leading indicators, competencies, process, adoption. The what just happens to be this enablement strategy. The challenge that a lot of people face today is they're starting from the left. They're starting from the enablement strategy and working the other way.
Yeah.
It's not quite hitting the mark because you don't know, right? So that's how we can solve for one, how do we define the right things? But then of course, now you're going from left to right again, strategy to leading indicators to sales velocity to revenue gap to actually measure what we've done. Now, again, this is where it becomes a challenge because attribution is difficult, right? You can't pin the one thing that we did on that impact. Let's say we found 5% win rate, incremental gain. So the example I can give you, a realistic example is a company that I was working with wanted to go from something like $90 million to $110 million, right? So around about 18-20%, uplift year on year. And we essentially defined, how many opportunities do they have? What's the average deal value? What's the win rate? So we can define those levers and benchmarks. Then we simulated what it's going to take for them to find that 20% gain, right? So we said, okay, you need to find 6% in opportunities, you need to find 3% in deal value. Win rate was the key, right? Because we didn't just look at what they need to find. We looked at the trend as well. Month on month, we could see that win rate was going down, and the trend line from where it started to where it was the biggest. That was the most concerning thing. So the question became, how do we bring it back up? Win rate was the focus. So now we just always know where we've got to focus. And we kind of looked at it and essentially what we defined was, it's business case. Business case is the thing for these guys because they were doing it very inconsistently. Not everyone was doing it. There was no structure to it. So the first thing was define a competency that people can measure, observe and measure and coach against. That competency was a relentless focus on value-driven sales, right? The process as a leading indicator was the creation of a business case for every deal worth over 100K, right? And then the adoption leading indicator was the number of deals over 100K which had a business case attached to it, right? And there's obviously there's a competency around all of this, which is the ability to run a ROI calculation and manage all of that. So there's a lot of things went into it. The key is when we measured this, what we essentially agreed to was, look, if I can find you a 1% lift in win rate, is that realistic, right? And that 1% was not going from 26% win rate, which is what it was, to 27%. It's 1% of 26%. So going from 26% to 26.3%, let's say. Point is that 3.3% gain was worth if you put it in the equation I've just described, was worth a cool $1 million a year.
Yeah.
0.3.
Yeah.
And up front, I had the buy-in, right, which was, yeah, that's realistic, right? If you did this for the business case thing, you can find us 0.3%, $1 million, right, versus whatever the investment was into that. That's, you know, how I kind of do it. And it's a bit of a long answer, but it's not an exact science, but there's a way to negotiate that, right? There's a way to drill down into it. So that's how I'm doing it.
I agree. I think there's some specific levers. We call that pipeline pH, which is like it looks at the acidity of your pipeline. Is it good? Is it bad? And then this is those 4 metrics essentially put together. And the calculations we have are exactly, they're saying the same thing. The exponential accelerator you get from increasing a tiny amount of your conversion rate or decreasing a tiny amount of your sales cycle duration is greater and much faster to do than anything you can do on the coverage point or anything that you will have to engineer to actually increase your price, which usually sits with product. So yeah, I'm sold on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there with those 4 levers as well. And in particular, the scenario that you just spoke about increasing the win rate really resonates, as Mick said, with me and him for our own experiences and obviously our experience at Jointflows and what we try to solve as well. But across the sector, from an enablement point of view, then, where if we just look at those 4 levers, are you finding that win rate is where it's at? That's the quickest way to move the needle? I know there's no simple answer, but are you finding that in the main, that's where it is? Are you finding that it's higher up in terms of the number of ops, or is it typically the sales cycle duration and win rate?
So there's no easy answer to this, right? The fact is, right now in the current economy, everything is trending downwards, right? Except length of sales cycle, which is going up, not a good thing.
Yeah.
So everything is trending downwards. Having said that, I did see a survey done very recently, a poll, actually, a LinkedIn poll from another company, and they spelled out the 4 levers and said, which one's most important to you? There's quite a lot of responses to that, over a few hundred, right? And the number 1 was opportunities or pipeline, top of funnel. And I looked at it and I thought, how did they even know that, right? And there's lots of responses on there. There's from lots of VP of sales development type people saying, of course, without pipeline, there's nothing else, right? So that's the focus. Traditionally, companies have, when they wanted to grow revenue, they've been able to just throw budget at pipeline, hire teams of SDRs, right? The SDR boom we saw in the last 2-3 years, right? Globally, but the teams of SDRs, they threw money into marketing. They don't have that luxury anymore, right? You can't just hire teams of SDR. You don't have the budget to just throw into marketing. In fact, you're letting people go and you're cutting that budget down. And at the same time, if you are filling your pipeline, the analogy I've used is, you're filling your bucket with water, but that bucket might have holes in it, meaning your win rate is declining, your deal value is declining, your leverage starts going up, right? So why don't you just fix the holes first before you fill the pipeline? But even then, it's not that's a debate to be had, right? It absolutely depends on each and every single company's circumstance, situation, a level of analysis to determine what the benchmarks are for each of those levers, and then understanding the trend lines, right? Are we going up? Are we stable? Are we going down? And if we're going down, where's the biggest impact for us in terms of what we can solve for? So without a level of analysis, you cannot answer that question, what's most important. You need to have the data, which is why I come back to being data-driven, right? You need to be able to drive the right decisions. And there is no simple answer just to say, yeah, this is the most important to us. You don't know that unless you've done the deep enough level of analysis, trending, and simulation.
Yeah. It's funny because we had another guest on the podcast a few days ago, and that person was saying that the state of sales leadership is becoming poorer and poorer, and one of the problems with that is because of it, you can't analyze and identify where the actual opportunities are. So often what happens is you always revert to what's actually the most available, which is increasing activity volume on the prospection side, because it's something that you can do without having to think about it. It's like, okay, I'm sending 100 emails, let's send 1,000 emails if I need to 10x my revenue. And obviously this has a diminishing returns on the rest of the metrics, because the more you do that, the poorer the quality is, the poorer the opportunity quality, which affects the rest of the metrics. You mentioned on when we were getting ready for the call, you said something that intrigued me. You spoke about modern sales enablement, as opposed to what is it like? How do you differentiate modern versus maybe what traditional? What would be the
I think it's not too different from my definition of operational enablement versus strategic enablement. There's a lot that goes into each other's definitions, right? As to what makes something operational, what makes something strategic. But enablement, if you think about the history of where enablement's even from, I guess that's the best way to answer. Look at where it's come from. And it started with the proliferation of SaaS, B2B SaaS, back in the early 2000s with Salesforce and ServiceNow and SuccessFactors. B2B enterprise SaaS really became mainstream. And then suddenly companies realized that this decades-old sales training we've been doing might not be relevant anymore, or at least it perhaps needs to evolve, because now we've got a completely different way of selling, different way of even building our products, different way of marketing our products, different way of retaining and renewing our customers, maintaining them, servicing them, supporting them, right? Customer success was also born around then. So they realized that sales training isn't it, right? It's going to have to be something more. So sales enablement as a principle was formed because it didn't just focus on training and onboarding, which is traditionally what we think of when we think of sales enablement. It was also focused on improving the productivity and efficiency of reps, which was critical in a SaaS model, right? And thirdly, it was also focused on sales effectiveness. So best practices, how we do good things, how do we learn from what others are doing? Because this whole thing was new, right? So how do we learn about and capture those best practices as what top performers are doing, and how do we propagate that across everybody? But also it became about experience, right? So under an effectiveness, what sort of experience are we providing to our buyers? How do we differentiate using our experience? How do we measure the buyer's engagement? How do we improve at that engagement, right? All those kind of things. Also alignment, right? So the fourth pillar I would kind of consider is sales alignment. So alignment between this trifecta of sales, product, and marketing. Right? From a marketing standpoint, it's pretty obvious. It's all around product marketing, content strategy, let's say. It's about campaign strategy, outbound strategy, inbound strategy, all those kind of things where we require alignment between sales and marketing, account-based marketing strategies. For product, it's all about go-to-market. And then the last kind of pillar that I typically focus on when it comes to modern enablement is often overlooked, which is sales engagement. What I mean by that is there's a few things, but ultimately it's how do we ensure that our salespeople are not just leaving the company, but are not even thinking about it. Because the minute you start thinking about it, that's when your engagement and productivity drops, and that's when quota is going to get hit, right? So engagement, how do we provide our reps with a good experience, frustration-free, friction-free? How do we ensure there's a alignment between manager and rep? Because that's where the frustration typically starts. How do we ensure that there's a career path in place, a transparent career path that people can take accountability for? They can progress, they can see how they're going to progress at the company. I think importantly, one of the most important things that is becoming more and more prevalent these days is well-being. So, all of the things I've just talked about, metrics and data and enablement and tech and everything else, you can have the best of that. You can be absolutely amazing. But if your sales teams are burnt out, and let's face it, right, the pressures that everyone's under right now, jobs on the line, jobs being lost, harder to hit quotas, all of the measures going, dipping downwards. People are on edge, right? Because it's their lifestyles at risk, it's their homes at risk, it's their families, that's going to lead to burnout and an impact on well-being. So you can have the best of everything, but if that well-being isn't there, then what's the point? Right? None of it works. So enablement kind of morphed into kind of what I've just described, right? The problem is not everyone kept up with that. And a lot of people just kind of stayed in the operational game, which was training and onboarding, content creation, measured on whether I completed something or not, measured on popularity, measured on checkbox exercises, right? Not revenue impact. So that's how I kind of see it. I see a lot more data-driven approaches. I see a lot more financial savvy enablers, analytical, and got to mention, I guess, on every call that we're on, those who embrace and leverage AI to do what needs to be done. So, yeah, that's kind of where I see it going on a high level.
Nice. Well, look, we are just about almost out of time, but to wrap up, we always ask one final question, which is, throughout your career, what's your best memory within the sales enablement space?
Oh, there's been a few, but I think one of the most impactful, as an individual, as a person, maybe even emotionally, is always when I can enable 200, 500, 1,000 people, right? But it's when I sit down with that one person, with that one rep, and I really show them something that not only opens their eyes, but the feedback that you get, that once I did that thing, whatever it was, that it actually allowed them to not just close a deal, earn a commission, make a lifestyle change, right? So essentially impacting people's life is so important. And at the end of the day, I talk a lot about data, we will talk about tech and all of that, but enablement is a people business, right?
Yeah.
After everything, if we can just focus on the people, that's how we change the landscape of business, right? So I think that's really impactful, and that's happened to me a few times now. So it's got pride in that.
Awesome. Well, look, Kunal, we appreciate you joining us. This has been the Revenue Revolution podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.